Hi guys, and welcome to the second live stream of the day. I'm Libertman, forced to be alone but free to decide how. In today's episode we're going to take a step back from the usual why men reject therapy more than women kind of narrative and look directly at what social isolation does to the human brain. Because if we want to understand why so many men avoid therapy, disconnect, and shut down, we first need to see what chronic isolation does to the brain architecture that supports emotions, motivation, and social behavior. So today's study is brain structural and functional changes in socially isolated humans. A systematic review by the authors Tomova, Andrews Hanna, and Blakemore from 2021. It's a systematic review from 2021 and it looks at human brain imaging studies on social isolation. So regarding the study setup and why the study matters for men and therapy, this paper is not the men versus women therapy paper. It's about what long-term social isolation does to the brain. But that's exactly why it's important for this channel. A lot of men spend years isolated, emotionally, socially, or both. Many of them never go to therapy at all, never speak to anyone and try to tough it out right? Over time, that's not just a psychological issue, but it starts to show up in brain structure and function. So what we'll do today is to read and unpack the abstract in clear and in the most simple language I can, and summarize the main findings of the review, what changes in the brain with isolation. And then in the second part of the live stream, connect this to why men reject therapy and how this plays out in each of the 4 macro groups of the C4PC model. Those groups are the internal rationals, the internal emotionals, the external rationals, and the external emotionals. So, all right, let's start with the simplified version of the abstract, and because I cannot read it in full, and then we start breaking down the main parts. So this review looks at brain imaging studies of people who experience social isolation or strong feelings of loneliness. The authors examine both structural and functional changes in the brain, focusing on areas involved in reward, emotion, and self-related thinking. Across the studies, social isolation is consistently linked with changes in brain regions that process social information, regulate stress, and support mental health. These alterations are associated with higher risk of depression, anxiety, and cognitive problems, suggesting that chronic isolation can reshape the brain in ways that make people more vulnerable to mental health difficulties. So now let's put that into very plain language. So basically, what are they saying? They took a bunch of brain imaging studies, MRI, fMRI, different kind of scans, and looked at people who were socially isolated or very lonely. Then they asked, do their brain look different? Do their brains work differently when doing tasks or looking at social information? And do those brains differences connect to mental health problems? And the answer was yes. Across a lot of studies, they see patterns like regions involved in emotion and social pain become more reactive or more sensitive. Also, regions involved in reward and motivation can become less responsive. Also, networks that support self-reflection and social understanding show altered activity. And these changes are linked with higher depression, anxiety, and cognitive difficulties. So it's not I feel lonely, that's it. It's if I'm chronically isolated, the entire operating system of my brain begins to adapt to that isolation. And when we later ask, why would someone in that state reject therapy and withdraw or shut down? So this is part of the answer. So, okay, now just a brief word on how they did this. the methodology, but without going too technical, as I explained in the first episode. I'm not going to go too deep in the technical aspect of the study's methodology. But they didn't run on a single experiment. They did a systematic review, which means that they searched the scientific literature for all the brain imaging studies that looked at social isolation or strong loneliness in humans. They filtered out low quality or irrelevant studies, and then they compare and organized the results to see consistent patterns across different samples, ages, and methods. So instead of one small experiment with 30 people or so, they are standing on top of many studies put together, which gives a more reliable big picture. So now let's move into what we all care about. That is, what did they find? What are the key findings of this study? I'll try to break it down into a few simple chapters that you can read, that you can grasp from all these results. So the first key idea here is that social isolation changes the social pain and threat systems. One of the clearest patterns is that social isolation is linked to changes in brain regions that handle social pain and threat. So in simple terms, when you are chronically isolated, your brain can start reacting to social situations as something dangerous or at least risky and not safe. That can mean feeling judged more easily, expecting rejection, interpreting neutral situation as hostile. And so for a man who already doesn't trust people, this makes opening up in therapy feel even more risky. So another important pattern, a second finding, is that another important pattern is in the reward and motivation networks. The review shows that people who are very isolated or lonely often have altered activity in the brain's reward circuits. So this, in plain language, might look like social interactions feel less rewarding, and you don't get that warm feeling from being with others, and you might feel numb even when something good happens. So imagine trying to convince that brain to go to therapy, right? From the inside, it can feel like, what's the point? Nothing changes. Nothing feels good anyway. And the third finding is related to the self-related thinking and rumination. The authors also discuss changes in networks that support self-related thinking. That is how we talk to ourselves in our own head. In chronic isolation, people can get stuck in negative self-talk and also see themselves as the problem or defective, and replay all failures and humiliations over and over in their heads. This is where therapy could help the most. But if your brain is already wired into this spiral, it's very easy to reject any outside help because you don't feel worth helping, or you assume that nobody will understand you. The next key finding of this study is the link to mental health problems. The abstract makes it clear that these brain changes are not just interesting details. They are linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and cognitive problems. So isolation is not just a personality choice or an introvert lifestyle. If it becomes chronic, it starts to increase your vulnerability to mental illness. It starts to reduce your flexibility to change and make it harder to seek and receive help. In other words, the longer you stay isolated, the heavier the door becomes when you finally try to open it and walk into a therapist office. So, as you can see, this study gives us a powerful frame. Social isolation reshapes the brain. Those changes make it harder to trust, to feel reward, and to see yourself in a balanced way. And that, in turn, helps explain why so many men reject therapy or only seek help when things are already collapsing. So in the next part of this live stream, we are going to translate all this into the language of the 4 macro groups of the C4PC model, which are the internal rationals, the internal emotionals, the external rationals, and the external emotionals. Sorry, I have to repeat it many times, especially at the beginning of the channel, until people get used to them, because these are 4 new concepts that I have developed to reorganize and summarize lots of information about personality types and makes it easier. So we will look at how isolation feels from inside of each of these 4 personality styles, and why each group tends to reject therapy in a different way. But before we jump there, if you are finding this useful, or it's making something click for you, this is a really good moment to like the live stream and subscribe to the channel. I would hardly appreciate that. It's a great support for this content. It takes you 1 second, but it's a huge support to keep this kind of content coming and to help other men find it through the algorithm, the weird YouTube's algorithm. And so, as we were saying, this review shows that chronic isolation doesn't only feel difficult, it literally changes how the brain interprets threat, reward, self-worth, and connection. So now what we're going to do is take these findings and look at them through the lens of the C4PC model, the 4 macro group personality groups that explain how men process the world internally, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. And so each of these groups experiences loneliness differently. And each group rejects therapy for completely different psychological reasons. So let's break it down group by group. Let's start with the internal rationals, that are the introverts and analytical and self-contained. How isolation affects their brain. Well, isolation in the internal rationals intensifies overthinking, the rumination, the emotional detachment, and the hyper-independence of this group. Because the review showed increased activity in self-focused rumination networks and reduced reward response. Internal rational slide deeper into cognitive isolation, even if they are not socially isolated physically. For them, the brain becomes a closed loop that is comprised of think, analyze, overanalyze, shut down. And then begins again, think, analyze, overanalyze, shut down. So why they reject therapy? The internal rationals reject therapy because they believe they should solve everything alone. They say to themselves, if I can't figure it out myself, then I'm weak. They also reject therapy because they don't trust emotional processes. Talking about feelings feels inefficient, vague, or humiliating. They reject therapy because their reward systems are flattened. So nothing feels motivating, including the idea of improving. And because they interpret therapy as judgment. So social pain circuitry kicks in, and it states that opening up is equal to risk, is equal to threat, danger. So how this group watches therapy from a distance. They often think, I will go when it's really bad. And also, I don't want anyone inside my head. Or I'll handle it with logic. But isolation rewires their logic. It turns it inward until they become prisoners of their own thoughts. That is one of the trap. So now let's move to the second group, the internal emotionals, which are the introverts who are sensitive and deep feeling. So how isolation affects their brain? For this group, isolation amplifies emotional pain, the sensitivity to rejection. It amplifies the negative self-image. It amplifies catastrophizing every situation or potential situation. And the isolation amplifies attachment anxiety. The studies finding that isolation heightens threat and social pain circuits hits this group the hardest. Their brain becomes everything hurts more than it should kind of feeling. That becomes consistent and permanent. So why they reject therapy? They avoid therapy because they fear being misunderstood or dismissed. They say to themselves, what if I open up and they don't get it? They assume their emotions are a burden. Years of isolation make them feel like too much. So they expect rejection or criticism. and therapy becomes another arena for anticipated pain. And they also avoid therapy because they feel ashamed of needing help, even though they need it the most. They are the group that need it the most. So how this group watches therapy from a distance? They often think, I'm scared they'll think I'm dramatic, or I don't want to cry in front of a stranger, or my problems are probably not important enough. So isolation slowly convinced them that opening up is unsafe. Now let's move to the external rationals, which are the extroverts who are also analytical and assertive, and how isolation affects their brain. For this group, isolation causes frustration, irritability, loss of identity with no audience, no feedback loop that they need, stagnation, and emotional disconnection. This study's finding about decreased reward activation is key here, because external rationals normally rely on achievement, on action, and social feedback to regulate themselves constantly, every day. So isolation cuts the fuel supply for them. And why they reject therapy? They tend to reject therapy because they don't want to feel powerless. Therapy feels like giving control to someone else. They see emotions as obstacles. They prefer solutions and not introspection or constant introspection. They reject therapy because they fear being slowed down, as therapy demands reflection, patience, humility most of the times. So that is uncomfortable for this group. And they reject therapy because social pain activation is like equals to defensiveness. No, right? They perceive therapeutic confrontation as a threat. So how this group watches therapy from a distance? They tend to think, I don't need therapy, I just need to fix my situation. Or I don't want someone telling me what to do. Or I'll figure it out myself once I get momentum again. But isolation removes the momentum they depend on. So in normal context or situation, those way of thinking might work for them, but in this special constant and circumstance of being isolated, everything changes. And then we have the last group that are the external emotionals, who are the extroverts, who are also expressive and relational. How isolation affects their brain? Well, this group suffer most visibly from isolation. They get into emotional instability, impulsivity, and loneliness-driven behaviors, and loss of meaning, and higher anxiety and sadness levels. So the study shows that isolation affects the same emotional networks this group relies on for connection. So the brain becomes hyper-reactive and craving contact, but fearing it. Why they reject therapy? Well, they do because they fear being too emotional. Isolation makes their feelings more intense, so they fear judgment. they depend on constant social validation, and if the therapist doesn't immediately soothe or affirm or validate, they feel rejected. So they reject therapy as they seek comfort and not deep work. But therapy sometimes challenge them, or not sometimes, every time, and that's why it's challenging for them, especially. And they also reject therapy because they get overwhelmed easily. The emotional circuitry in the brain is already overloaded. So how this group watches therapy from a distance. They say to themselves, I don't want to relive everything, or I'm scared I'll break down, or they say to themselves, I started therapy once but didn't feel understood. So isolation cuts them from the very connections they need to heal. So let's jump now into a final integration, why men reject therapy, stepping back across all 4 macro groups. This study explains something that is essential. Isolation reshapes the brain in ways that make seeking help feel unsafe, pointless, or humiliating. And because men tend to isolate more consistently, more quietly, and for more years, they reach therapy because they reach therapy with weaker reward responses, with stronger threat responses, with damaged self-concepts, with avoidance of vulnerability, with chronic rumination, and with chronic emotional shutdown. So this is not a character flaw. It's not men don't care. It's not men don't want help. It's often a neurological loop caused by years of isolation. So to conclude this live stream and findings integration, understanding male avoidance of therapy begins long before the therapy office. It begins with years, sometimes decades of emotional and social isolation that slowly rewires the brain. And for each of the 4 C4PC macro groups, that isolation interacts with personality in very different but equally powerful ways. If this resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in any of these patterns, that already means you are more aware than most men ever allow themselves to be. And awareness is always the first doorway out of isolation. So thank you so much for being here and joining the live stream, or if you're watching the replay. I highly appreciate your comment, your thoughts, your feedback on this episode, your questions as well. I will address them later. And I highly appreciate if you can like this video and subscribe to the channel to support the content. And see you in the next one.